Okay, so today we're going to be talking about variables and how they work inside of Integromat. Now, Integromat's quite unique in that it allows you to store variables and to update those variables and to get those variables within your scenario. Now, it's quite common that you'll be doing this for something like Google Sheets, where maybe you're searching for or you're finding whatever it is. I think it's search. There it is, search rows. So, maybe you want to get some data into Google Sheets. So first you would search to see if that data already exists in Google Sheet. And then if that data did not exist, well, you would add the row. And if that data did exist, well, you would update that data. So as a simple example here,
Hi, I just wanted to quickly mention the free Integromat course available on the link below in the description. It teaches you all the basics of Integromat, including how to work with arrays, how to iterate, how to aggregate, all those fun things that are pretty complicated to learn. It's all in that free Integromat course. The link is below in the description. And thanks for watching the video.
that you could map the same values in both of these if you wanted to, or you could use a variable. So you could say, okay, well, if Google Sheets does not have a row with that data in it, then add that row and then store the row ID as a variable. And so we'll store that from the add row module, not the search rows module. And if it does have that row, then we will store that row as a variable. And then we will get that variable to then update that row. So it will look something like this. And of course we need a filter in here, and the filter would be, we have to map this one here first. So we'll just select any spreadsheet, doesn't really matter. And we'll select a sheet, yada yada. And you can put whatever you like in there. Okay, so now we've got our metadata, and we can simply say if row ID does not exist, then create the row and then set the row variable. If row ID does exist, then set the row ID, or the row number. And then we want to then get the row number, which will be, I think we called it row ID, didn't we? Let's have a look. Yep. Now, importantly with those variable names is they're case sensitive. So, you want to make sure that you're checking that. And then we could, of course, map the row ID into here and just update the row. So, why would you do that? Well, if you've got a lot of data that you're having to map, you could basically just use a variable so that you're creating a row and you're just simply adding the minimal amount of data there, maybe an ID for a pipe drive record or something like that. And then you're just simply updating, or you're getting the row ID from either here or here. And then you're using that to then update the rest of the fields, which might be 200 different fields here. So rather than having to map 200 fields in two modules, you just have to map it in one module, and this little bit of logic will work quite nicely. Now, one important thing here is that the router works in a particular sequence, and routers work in a clockwise sequence. And that's really important if you're going to be using variables like this, because you want to make sure that when a bundle of data gets to this variable, which is a get variable module, that particular variable exists. If we had, say, this module after this get variable module, then even though the row ID exists, that row ID has not been stored in that variable yet because it hasn't taken this path yet. So remember with routers that they work in a clockwise order. So it takes path 1, then it will take path 2, then it will take path 3. Or it will try to take each path. And it will try to take the path, and if there's a filter on there that says, no, you can't go down this path, then it tries the next path, and so on and so forth. So that's how you can use those variables to temporarily store values and read them. Now, you may also want to use a variable. I should mention also that you can get multiple variables at one time and also set multiple variables at one time. But you may also want to set a variable for something like a date. So date, and you may want to do that because you want to format a date or pass a date, whatever it is. And sometimes that date may be broken. And the benefit of having a variable is that you can use the variable to. Why did it do that? All right. Let's do this instead. So you may want to use a variable to do this because you'll get an error on this particular date. And dates are generally the trickiest type of data types to work with. You've got time zones and all those sort of things to worry about. So with a date, it's quite common that you'll get an error, particularly if you're using formulas with a particular date. And if you're mapping 20 different dates into a Google Sheet, and one of those dates errors, well, then the whole mapping to that Google Sheet will error and nothing will get written. So if you had, for instance, mapped them all to a variable, and then each of those variables had an error handler, which would just simply ignore that one date if we got an error, well, then we could simply get all of those date variables that we've created, and we could just get date there, and then we could get birthday or whatever else, whatever other variables we've got. We could get them all, and then we can map them into Google Sheets. And if the variable didn't exist, well, then Google Sheets wouldn't get an error. It would just simply not map that that variable that errored. And if we had the handler, then the whole scenario wouldn't stop running. It would just ignore that one date that didn't work. So that's another way that you can use variables in here. Now, importantly with variables is that they exist for one complete execution. Okay, so one execution. Now, there's also an option in here of one cycle. Now, a cycle in terms of this is a repeating cycle, right? Whereas one execution is one execution of a scenario, okay? So you can basically assume that a variable will hold its value for the entire execution every time that that execution runs. And the reason why I bring that up is because it's very important if you are using variables and there is a chance that the variable may be empty for a record within that execution, that you null out those variables. So you'd have to set multiple variables, and as the last step in the scenario, you would basically null out all the variables that you've used, like so. Where are you? Null. There you are. And you'd basically map that in, and you'd null out those variables. If you don't null the variable, then what could potentially happen is we basically get a row, or maybe we don't get a row, but maybe we're updating something and data's coming in, we're searching to see if that row exists, blah, blah, and then we're updating a date, and the first bundle of data has that date, so therefore that variable exists. The second bundle of data doesn't have the date, but because we've already set that variable with the first bundle of data and it's the same execution, then the variable there would still exist from the first bundle of data. And so it would then get mapped across using the variable because it still exists. So to avoid that issue, you have to make sure that you null out the variable values before or between different data bundles. So that's very important. Otherwise, you'll end up getting the same data in, it could be a million different rows, and it will really stuff up your database and record keeping and all that sort of stuff because you've got a lot of mixing of data when you shouldn't have mixing of data. So that's just another little tip there for when you're using variables.